Thanks so much for joining us today, Carlos.
Oh, it's so great to be here and to speak with you again.
I'm really excited for our conversation. Carlos and I met when we were both on the tribal council, I believe it was called, for Thank You Plant Medicine. And I learned of your story, Carlos, actually on the Thank You Plant Medicine Coming Out Day, where you were so generous to come into the live stream we were doing and tell essentially not even your coming out story, but just tell your entire story about your history with psychedelics and how they have helped you. And that's why I wanted to come and have you on talking about ayahuasca for addiction. So let's go ahead and start there. If you could tell us a little bit about what brought you into this space.
Right. You know, I there's obviously a lot of paths that came together to get me to where I ended up, which is Iquitos, Peru, in the Amazon rainforest, working with indigenous curanderos. But because of the nature of this podcast, I'll focus on the addiction element of it. So in 2003, I had been slowly spiraling downward into addiction, but not calling it addiction. But I was, using drugs repeatedly to a point where sobriety was more unusual for me to be than to be high, which included like using heroin before going to work. And I think maybe that's like important to understand is that the vast majority of drug addicts are not like you see in the movies. They're pretty normal seeming people. They go to work, they maybe have families, they, have lives that you wouldn't consider to be like the dramatic, the way that you see them in the movies where they're out on the streets or something. Was I like choosing to buy drugs over food? Yeah, I was, but I still like got to work. I still had a career, and I was still good at it, to be honest. But my private life was starting to like unravel, and that culminated in the story that I told for the plant medicine, the Thank You Plant Medicine movement, which was waking up in my car underwater, having blacked out behind the wheel because I had been drinking and using drugs, and managed to drive into a river and almost died. Thankfully, my window was open, or I probably would have died because I couldn't open my door. I climbed out the window, I swam to shore, turned around to watch my car like go all the way under, and had no idea where it was. And that turned out to be the most pivotal moment of my life. And I look back and I'm super thankful that that happened. That horrible thing and that crazy night that scared me so much was enough to motivate me to make a big change in my life. And that's when I started to actually recognize that I did have a problem. Before, yeah, I didn't look at it, and I wasn't in the presence of people that didn't have problems. I was only in the presence of people that had the same problems as me, and we weren't talking about our addictions. I was never saying to my addict friends, "Hey, I think you've got a problem." Um, and they weren't either to me. And so at that point, I actually managed to just stop using hard drugs. I was still like smoking a lot of weed and drinking as a way to kind of cope with the trauma of that experience. And also like alcohol and marijuana are like so everybody gives them a pass,
Yeah.
as opposed to like harder drugs like heroin. And I just prayed, and I kind of made a declaration that I was gonna make a big change in my life, but I didn't know how. And I got an email randomly from a friend who was in Iquitos, Peru, randomly, really. And she met two guys that knew about ayahuasca. They were drinking ayahuasca with a shaman. They were not from Peru, they were from Russia. And when they said ayahuasca, she remembered a conversation that I had had with her 3 years earlier about ayahuasca. Because in 1999, I started like researching plant medicines just out of curiosity and stumbled across ayahuasca. And she remembered, because I was her introduction to understanding ayahuasca or knowing about it. And she decided to send me an email to see if I wanted to fly down to Iquitos and drink ayahuasca because she was going to. And I thought that was so bizarre, that I got that email at that time because it was just a week later, maybe 10 days later. And I instantly recognized it to be a sign and an opportunity, an omen, I guess. And so I said, let's do it. And it was really important to me, I think. Had I not had that experience where I drove my car into the river, I might still have decided to go to Peru, but I wouldn't have put so much into that decision because I knew, and it makes a big difference, which is why I'm bringing it up, obviously. I knew that it was going to save my life. It wasn't like, let's try this. I said this was a message, this was an omen. The universe is trying to bring me back on course and, back to my path in life. And me doing this is going to do that. I knew that. It didn't take drinking ayahuasca to get to that point. I knew already when I got on the plane, I knew, when I got to Lima, I knew just continuously all the way. And I think that was just really, really important because something I've seen so many times now from running the Ayahuasca Foundation is that people show up with a lot of different attitudes and beliefs. And when people show up with a similar belief and attitude that I had, where they say something like, this is going to be what I needed, this is exactly what I've been hoping to do. I know that I'm in the right place. Some things along those lines, then I just know that, oh, it's gonna work out great for you. And not everybody arrives that way. Some people do arrive with, well, I've tried a lot of stuff, so I thought I'd give this a shot. And there's a real big difference in attitude and what I call inner environment. And to me, it's a lot like gardening. You want to make the best soil possible to plant your seeds, and the results you get from growing those seeds is mostly determined by the quality of the soil they're planted in. And so for me, like, inner environment is our attitude, our consciousness, our belief system, all of those combine to form like this soil, whether it be fertile or not, or along the spectrum of fertility or nourishment, to put medicine into. And the results are directly correlated to that. And that's what happened for me. And I didn't recognize that at the time, but now looking back, I can see like, oh man, had such fertile soil. My inner environment was so like dying to have that seed planted. And so it just took, of course the seed needed to be there. The soil doesn't grow a garden by itself, but having that, I was perfectly prepared.
That's a beautiful description of the set from Set and Setting, I think. Like that mindset, the consciousness. I love that. The fertile soil that you had already going into it. And I'm assuming that you haven't found that a slightly less fertile soil means they won't, they're guaranteed not to have the effects that they're coming for, but it's just more likely that they will if they have that inner knowing that this is definitely part of their healing journey.
Totally, totally. I mean, ayahuasca is such a powerful medicine that even if you showed up with concrete, you could crack that wide open and nourish your soil in one ceremony, and that's kind of the magic of it, is that you could walk into a ceremony with zero faith and walk out with 100%. And there's very few things that I think can achieve something in such a short amount of time the way ayahuasca can change your attitudes and beliefs. So it's certainly very, very powerful. But obviously, if you're interested in optimizing your inner environment, if you're trying to make sure that you get the greatest outcome. Because what I just described, turning your concrete into fertile soil, that doesn't happen all the time. It can happen, but it doesn't, it's not the norm, I would say. And so, obviously doing the most work you can to try to optimize your inner environment, to optimize the outcome, essentially, is what we all want to do, is going to be beneficial.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's great advice. Now, you go down there, you drink ayahuasca. What was the addiction process like for you? So, were you still drinking and using cannabis up until the ceremony? And then what happened after?
Right. Well, I mean, to be honest, even when I assessed my addiction, cannabis wasn't a part of it. Like I said, cannabis gets such a like the pass where if it's kind of like cigarettes, like if you are an alcoholic, well, you still are going to smoke cigarettes, maybe,
Yeah.
And for me, that was like, yeah, well, I'm addicted to heroin, but that's not, smoking weed isn't a problem. Even though I smoked weed, I took like, no lie, like I took at least 16 bong hits a day. I woke up and took 4 bong hits before work. I came on my lunch break, I'd go home and take 3 bong hits. And after work, I'd take 4 more bong hits, have a couple before dinner, have some before I went to bed. And then sometimes I'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning just to take a couple bong hits and go back to bed. But I still didn't think that I had an addiction problem with weed. So to answer that question, yeah, I smoked weed. I smoked weed the entire time. I didn't even try to stop smoking weed because I didn't think I had a problem with it. But I was also using harder drugs. I realized that you could just go to a pharmacy in Peru and just ask for Valium, and you didn't need a prescription. So I was like, okay, great. So I bought Valium and diazepam, it's called, and I started taking it every day. And so, I didn't try to smuggle any drugs into the country, but I definitely was taking drugs every day leading up to my first ceremony. I don't remember if I took diazepam that day, but I definitely took it the day before.
Wow. And so then, did you do one ceremony or did you do a number of ceremonies in a
No,
sequence?
yeah, I did 5 ceremonies and they were separated by 2 or 3 days. So
Okay.
it was like twice a week for
Got
2.5 weeks.
Okay, okay. So this is a 2.5 week process. Can you talk about how your feelings, like the feelings of addiction, that compulsion feeling, how did that progress through that 2.5 week period?
Well, the first ceremony, I should like put the important caveat that I was not doing a retreat. This was 2003. Retreat centers didn't exist. The term ayahuasca tourism had not yet been invented. And so I was basically just going to a shaman's house for a ceremony, and after the ceremony, I would go back to my where I was staying, and I didn't see the shaman outside of the ceremony. That I mean, I did go and visit him once, and I took a picture. But I think that's kind of important. So I was like, no guidance. No one was saying follow this diet beforehand. No, nothing. And I didn't know. I don't know how much information was out there, but I don't recall seeing any real information about interactions or counterindications. So I went into a ceremony essentially like as polluted as I could be. I had been using Valium every day. I'd been smoking weed. I'd been eating anything I felt like eating, even that day. Um, and so I threw up like 15 times that first ceremony. I had diarrhea several times, including like crapping my pants. And like there were no like mattresses, no buckets, no, we were on dirt floor, like just the way that it was probably done for a very long time. I just threw my underwear into the jungle, and I was a mess. I was just a total mess. And but yet thankfully I was able to recognize that no one else was a mess, and there were all these locals in the ceremony, like just Peruvians, and none of them were seemingly having the same problems that I was. And I, pretty much understood that this is the result of my drug addiction. So right off the bat, there was a very direct correlation to how unhealthy I was, just how polluted I was, how toxic I was. And I did not want to have that experience again. My next ceremony was, I did not want to crap my pants again. And I didn't want to spend the whole night just puking. And so because of that, like it was kind of easy. After the first ceremony, I was like, well, I'm not going to do stupid drugs again. But again, marijuana wasn't that wasn't like part of it. I was like, well, I smoked weed right after the ceremony because I just didn't tie those two together. It was actually like, honestly, it was years later that I stopped smoking weed. And it was through my own direct communication with ayahuasca. Um, but that first night, I stopped using hard drugs or chemical drugs or anything but marijuana, and I think that was like definitely as a reaction. Uh-oh,
You're back. So if you just
sorry
say,
about that.
no worries, if you could just start by saying that was definitely a reaction.
Yeah, it was definitely a reaction for me to my experience where I just was gonna stop. I'm gonna stop right now. Now, I had already wanted to stop. And that was the first, like after the incident with the river, that was my first like I want to stop. I had never actually wanted to before. And so now again I was like made a commitment, like I'm gonna stop now. It was like fitting, the timeline. I'd come down to save my life, and now I'm actually drinking ayahuasca, so I'm gonna stop. And but all I really had to do was stop until the next ceremony, and I think that was kind of not so incredible a feat, to make it a couple days until the next ceremony. Um, but right off the bat, like there was this desire to do that, and that was a reaction to me just having such a horrible experience. But I also gained a lot of insight as to my attitude and my reaction. And so it wasn't just that I was toxic and polluted. That was a physical level, but on a mental and emotional level, I saw more about how I chose to react, how my thoughts were contributing to the unpleasantness of the situation, and also how much fear had played into how negative an experience I'd had. And so all of those like combined, on a physical, emotional, and mental level to give me a great insight to go back and do it again.
And had anything come up at that point? A lot of what you, I think, if I correct me if I'm wrong here, when you're doing like five ceremonies in a row, sometimes that first ceremony is more on the superficial level, like you're describing that you were having reactions to what was going on in the ceremony. Did as they went along, did you happen to get more insights as to perhaps root causes of the addictive behaviors that had popped up?
Yes, without a doubt. The second ceremony was absolutely amazing. It was so different. And I looking back, I definitely feel like I had made really important changes. And those changes made a big difference on a physiological level. Like my physical well-being was so different. I threw up once. I didn't have diarrhea at all. It was actually on a physical level quite a pleasant experience. And then because I didn't have fear, My reaction to the experience was incredibly pleasant. I remember describing it that all of the demons from my first ceremony had turned into angels in the second ceremony. And that was a statement about how my perception had changed. And, it was just like revelations, really. Um, a spirit came to me in the second ceremony and put his hand on my shoulder, which I felt tactilely, and I communicated with him and realized that he was the spirit of a dead member of my community that I had looked up to as a child but hadn't seen in 20 years. And like it was incredibly profound, but also I relived a childhood trauma that I had completely forgotten or buried, I suppose. But that I then saw how I had created a core truth of my identity based on that traumatic experience that was so detrimental that it had infected every relationship of my life since then. And I I relived it, so I reinterpreted the experience and I replaced that core truth of my identity with a more accurate truth that was no longer detrimental to me. And that made a massive difference in my life. The next day, I wrote to my parents to apologize and to forgive them and to start the long process of healing the infections that core identity misinterpretation had caused for the last 20 years. And that was, what I would say was when I knew that I was healed. I knew that, well, coincidentally, I also found a vine in that same ceremony growing out of my stomach, which for some reason I felt like I needed to follow. I followed the vine into the ground as my spirit and through the earth into outer space, at the end of which was a pterodactyl, a giant, shiny black pterodactyl, which I immediately said, "You were driving the car," and pulled out a sword that I had on me and sliced the thing into tiny pieces. Then I thought this thing might pull a Terminator 3 and form back together. So I pulled a laser beam out and I laser beamed the pieces until there was just this dust floating in outer space. And I knew that I had defeated my addiction because I had personified it or whatever, dinosaurified it. And so, to say that ceremony was profound would be an understatement. I left that ceremony knowing that the roots of my afflictions had been resolved, the trauma had been released, and that I had come face to face with my addiction as a being that I defeated, and that I had been supported by the spirit of a loved one who was so real that I could not only feel him, but my friend who had invited me to come down to Peru called out to me and said that she could see him while I was interacting with him, which I had not announced to anyone. And so that left me with this like rock solid belief. It wasn't just a belief anymore. It was a truth of the existence of spirit. And so, talking about like my inner environment, like everything was different now, everything was different.
Wow. Carlos, that is the most beautiful story. And I just love what a gift it was for you to have had all those separate forms of healing in the same ceremony to just like solidify with each other to the point where, like, I love that you say it's not a belief. Like, you don't have to believe that this happened. You know, it's a truth. It just exists in your body. This is a thing that you have defeated. Spirit helped you. Thank you for sharing that. That's absolutely just touching for anybody out there who may wonder, people who haven't tried ayahuasca. There's a wide variety of things that can happen, but so many of those are just profoundly helpful and transformative in the way that you got to see the root, you got to address the root, you had it support, and you physically, like you could dinosaurify and obliterate the demon. That's incredible. And so then the next day, or immediately thereafter, you feel completely like a new person, even from the inside out, right? Like this is a whole new, fresh start for you.
Exactly.
What was it like to go through those three remaining ceremonies?
Well, the third ceremony just like took it to another level, believe it or not. But the third ceremony started to like shape what would become my new life's path. So, the third ceremony, the curandero told me that it was my path to be a healer and invited me to be his apprentice and to live with him during the ceremony. And so I was like contemplating, would I accept this offer? Would I like make such a crazy, profound change in my life? And it was obvious that I had to. My experiences were just so monumentally profound, saying that, yes, this is exactly what you are meant to do, and this is why you were born. And and so when I left the third ceremony, I knew that it was my path to be a healer and that I was going to dedicate the rest of my life to this tradition. And, so after the second ceremony, I was a new person. But after the third ceremony, I knew who that person was, and where what to do, like where I was going. And so then the fourth ceremony, I went into the fourth ceremony knowing not only like the truth that spirits are real in such a way, like such a as real as me, but now I also knew that it was my path to be a healer. And so I knew that I would be healed that night. Now I had addiction, but I also had a physical illness that doctors couldn't diagnose that I'd had for 3 years. And because of my addiction, I never like focused heavily on it because I knew that I was like making it worse, and I think I just didn't want to deal with it. But I went to 3 different doctors and specialists to try to figure it out, and they just couldn't figure it out. But so that night I said, well, I'm going to figure it out. And I knew that I would because I had the third ceremony, So the fourth ceremony, I went in with the utmost confidence and faith in my ability to heal myself. And I did. And the way I healed myself was so fascinating. Like my spirit left my body. And then I turned around. And first I was hoping that I'd have x-ray vision and be able to see what was wrong with me, which I didn't. I then went into my mouth. My spirit went into my mouth and down into my stomach. So I was inside my body, but as a guest or, as from the outside in. And then I found the problem and I fixed it. And that was just so incredibly fascinating to me that I had been able to do that. And it confirmed, obviously, that I was right, that this is my path and that I am a healer. And so then by the time I got to the fifth ceremony, I mean, I don't know how much of me was left, like the previous me. It was so, I was on a whole nother dimension of reality, essentially. And so the fifth ceremony, I was just healing people, like distance healing them, healing my family members, like doing the work, healing people that were in that ceremony, and and starting my apprenticeship, singing along to every Ikaro, and just becoming the student that I would be.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that sequence of events. Like that's truly like imagine day one, so much vomiting, diarrhea. You're just like hanging on for dear life, and by the end, you are curing other people and helping the curandero. That's fantastic, and I love that you brought up that there's even a physical healing because there are a lot of things that I mean. not sure if they were the case in yours, but there's so much in that mental physical condition that ayahuasca can help through that connection, but it can also have a lot of anti-inflammatory and other effects physically. And then whatever you had in the middle, which was like you just knew that you could summon up spirit and help figure things out for yourself, which is an incredible power. So thank you for all of that. Now, here you are, you've done 5 ceremonies. You know this is like your new path. With that knowledge, and I realize that at that point, and I think it's very interesting that you bring this up, that like cannabis did not seem like a problem, and so it was not a problem that had to go away with the other addictions. And fair, like totally fair enough. There's a whole set of thoughts around that for sure, and we could have a whole other episode on that. But short of the cannabis that was still going on, what was your feeling after all those ceremonies? Because then, you know, like when you said, I only have to not use until the next ceremony, all of a sudden the ceremonies are done. Was there any desire to use anything aside from cannabis at that point at all?
Well, right then, no, I was in Peru. You know, I was still in the world where all that transformation took place. It wasn't until I went back where every single person I knew, you know, every person I knew was essentially a drug addict. You know, all of my friends, the world that I had come from was the world of addiction. But in Peru, no, man, it didn't even cross my mind. Like it was, you know, that was my world now. My new world was Peru. Unfortunately, I did go back to my old world, as we all have to do, and that's definitely way more challenging. You know, the healing part to me is actually kind of easy. It's that, you know, with me with the trauma, like it was easy for me to heal that trauma. I know that might sound crazy, but inside the ceremony, it wasn't such a crazy difficult ordeal for me. It took hours, you know, of my life where it had tormented me for decades and caused me to live a self-destructive life. And yet it took hours for me to remedy that, but I couldn't remedy the effect that it had on my life in terms of my relationships. My relationship with my mother didn't just instantly heal. My relationship with my father wasn't like I went back and he also now forgot the last 20 years, you know? And so the dynamics of my relationships with every single person had been so infected by that trauma or by me, that took a much, much tougher effort to get to a point where those were healed. And that took years to heal that. To heal my relationship with my mother took, 5 years. And I think that's important to point out because, it's great to, it's for the physical part. Yeah, that was healed. That was permanently healed, and it had never caused me, the dynamics of my relationships weren't affected by my physical condition. I maybe didn't do certain things or said no to certain people because of wanting to kind of protect my physical health, but it wasn't like the trauma. So the trauma was in need of healing on a much more expansive level than just me, and that took years. So when I went home, I pretty quickly fell off the wagon because I think that I was so overconfident that I was like, well, even if I do drugs now, I'm not going to be addicted, because I had transformed so much. And also because nobody coached me, like I said, there wasn't a retreat. No one was counseling me. I was just figuring things out, coming to my own decisions. No one said, hey, this is my path, maybe you should listen to my advice, or nothing. I was just on my own. And when I went back, it was almost like, hey, you're back from Peru, let's celebrate. That's what all my friends would want to do. And so it was hard to just say, no, you're not going to be my friend anymore. That was a tough pill to swallow. Haha, I didn't think about that. But that was the reality. I lost 95% of my friends. And I knew that that had to happen, but I didn't realize it at the time. When I got back home, I didn't think that I was going to say goodbye to all my friends
Wow.
until I started to see my life, as a transformed person in my old dimension. I realized that these aren't compatible, and that was hard, and that's probably the hardest part of it. Like even beyond the healing, because the healing with my family and my friends and things like that, that was like a heartfelt effort to connect. But the saying goodbye to the friends that weren't really friends, that were just like enablers, that we hung out with each other because they made us not have to think about the fact that we're addicts. That was like, it wasn't a lot of heartfelt stuff going on there. If you like have a friend who's an addict and you're an addict and then you stop, you're an asshole. You become like an enemy.
Yeah.
And so, that was definitely the hardest part of it all. But I'm sure that it's probably very common, even with a lot of counseling. It's just probably very common that people do fall off the wagon, or I'm not even a big fan of that term. They go back to certain habits they had, but they don't go back to them with the same way. Like their soul is mended, but the habits still remain. And so even though they might go back to the habits the way that I did, eventually they're not going to need them anymore. And that's what I've seen, in with other people also.
That makes a lot of sense. And how did you navigate that? Like you come back, you start using certain substances again, you realize that you're going to have to make a shift in your social circles to be in a healthier situation. How were you able to, like you said, not go back and start using with the same full force?
Well, I said I got to get out of here, and that's a tough one. Luckily, I had my parents, so I moved out of my house and I moved in with my dad, and I just like escaped to a different place where I didn't know anyone. And people would still call me to try to get me out, or try to get me back in, I guess. And but it was easier to say no on the phone,
Yeah,
than if I was down the street.
yeah, for sure. Now, how did you go from here? You're back home with your parents. How did you end up from there to where you end up founding the Ayahuasca Foundation?
It's just a one little hop.
Little step.
So that was June of 2003, and then in January of 2004, I moved to Iquitos, Peru. I moved into my teacher Don Juan's house and lived with him and his family, and I began studying. I didn't really have it all figured out. At that point, I just thought this is my path, and I think that my most likely future was that I was going to study, and then one day I'd be a shaman, and I'd come back, and I'd heal all those people that I knew needed healing from my community, and I'm pretty sure that was my plan. And but then 3 years in, I was sorting through and organizing my notes, and I had been, taking extensive notes, and I'd been recording ceremonies with a mini disc recorder, and I had a Sony video camera that used infrared, so I was filming in the ceremonies so I could see like what my teacher was doing, and I was, just I kind of feel like being a normal American student, but that was very unusual to do in the setting I was in. And so in a way, I probably was like pioneering certain things, like ways of learning. At any rate, I was organizing my own materials, and I looked at them all for the first time as a collection, and I said, man, what if someone had handed me this when I arrived? Like how fast I would have learned all this stuff. Because, learning, I use the word apprenticeship because it's commonly used, but it's kind of misleading because, at least with my experience, and I'm just guessing that it's a common experience, my teacher never sat me down. Even calling him a teacher, it certainly didn't match up with my other teachers from my childhood. There was never a class. I never had like my teacher say, "Hey, take a seat. I'm going to teach you something important today." That never happened. I was really his helper, would be a better way of saying, over apprentice. Like I just assisted him. Now, whether that was in a ceremony or whether that was making plant medicines or whatever it was, I just kind of shadowed him. If he went somewhere, I went there. And, that was an unbelievable experience. But it wasn't efficient. And I'm sure some people are going to say, hey, that's more efficient than you recognize. But I didn't feel it was efficient. I felt like he could have taught me something, much faster if he had just told me instead of letting me try to figure it out. And I get it, figuring things out is a way of learning that probably sticks with you more. At any rate, I still felt confident that if someone had handed me all of the materials that I had gathered in 3 years when I first arrived, I'd be way further in my understanding than I was. And so at that time, that gave birth to the idea of putting together a course for people like me that felt this was their path and their calling, and to make it easier for them to navigate that. And so I began teaching a course myself, which I called the initiation course. And my teacher really wasn't that into it. Don Juan, I mean, unbelievable healer, but he wasn't excited about the idea that I was proposing that he become a official teacher. And so after struggling to do that, I did a couple courses while living with him. I decided I would move out. That was also helped by my wife, who I met, who started wondering where our relationship was going to go because I lived with a shaman and his family of 20. And, was she going to move into that house? So I got my own apartment. That kind of freed me up, and I began to drink with other curanderos for the first time in my life. I'd never drank with any other curandero, and began to see that there were a lot of differences, and eventually met in 2008 Don Enrique Lopez, and he was almost instantly, I knew that he was the person that I had been hoping to meet. And in 2009, the two of us put together the Ayahuasca Foundation. And the educational aspect of it was the core. It was the vision. And he felt that it was his mission in life to teach the Shipibo healing tradition to people all over the world. And I felt the exact same way. And I was able to bring all of those people to him so that he could teach them his ancestral tradition. And so it was pretty perfect. And so, yeah, together in 2009, we started the Ayahuasca Foundation. Now, we did also offer healing retreats. We offered a 3-week retreat, but it was kind of, our focus was really the core initiation course. And so we've done 40 courses now, and it's still kind of the core vision for me. Obviously, it's one thing to heal 10 people, but if you can teach 10 people to become healers, then you're going to, contribute maybe more to the healing on the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for that incredible journey that you went through. I had no idea you were living in a house with 20 other people. That's just like, it's a fascinating story. 3 years in that situation, and you've learned so much, and then you finally sit with somebody else. Like, what an experience to be so immersed in one set of ceremony circumstances or maybe a set of ikaros, and then to see how another is done, and then your whole world kind of expands, and then you get to pass it on to others, which is incredible work that now you've been doing for over a decade. So thank you for how many people you have touched through that. You and I wanted to talk a little bit about how the fact that Ayahuasca Foundation was, you said, the first state-sponsored ayahuasca research, correct?
Government
Government
funded, yeah.
funded.
The
Okay.
British Medical Research Council funded our research last year.
Nice. Now, this episode is because your story is incredible and it deals with addiction. I wanted to focus this on ayahuasca and addiction, but as we were discussing before we started, there's not a lot of research out there on that specific topic. But you did do some research that dealt with the trauma, and like we were talking, that trauma is often at the root of addiction. So can you tell us a little bit about the research you all did?
Definitely. The research focused on childhood trauma, depression, and anxiety. And it was also the first ever epigenetic study on any psychedelic. Epigenetics, we were essentially looking at whether or not there could be changes in specific genetic markers that were associated with depression and anxiety, and through the treatment. It's important to me, and I stressed it heavily to the research team, who are incredible people, that what they were researching wasn't just ayahuasca. It had always kind of bothered me, and it still does, that the headlines of research would say ayahuasca does this, because as a student, I knew that you can't just say ayahuasca because it implies that it's a drug that if you just take it, it will happen. And you can't separate ayahuasca from the culture of its use. You can't separate the ceremony from the medicine. And there's so much that comes from the ceremony. In fact, maybe more of the benefit comes from the ceremony than does from the medicine itself. And so I never really liked that. And also, there's so many other plants that are used in every tradition, but the Shipibo tradition especially, like there's just so many medicinal plants that are employed in a treatment process. And ayahuasca is the anchor of the whole body of pharmacy of plant medicine, but you can't just deny the other plants, and so what we kind of came up with was the term in its native setting. And so the research was ayahuasca and plant medicine research in its native setting. And to me, that's very, very important. And I haven't done a lot of investigations to see how other research compares, but my guess is that not a lot of the research around ayahuasca was done in that way. And so to me, like doing clinical research on ayahuasca, I don't know how much value I would put in it. And I apologize because this is definitely like something for me and it's a side note, but I felt like it was an important one because I don't want people to misunderstand the idea like, oh, if I just get myself a bottle of ayahuasca, it will do this for me, and it's email. I get these emails a lot, like, how can I get a bottle of that stuff? I've heard it does great things, and I think it's really important to understand that this form of medicine is not like pharmaceutical medication. You can't just give it to someone with a placebo. To me, that idea of research has very little value. And so the research that we did do, I was super proud that we were able to write it in a way and describe it in a way that made sure that it wasn't just that ayahuasca. And because the word ayahuasca to me means so much more than just the drink. But the results of the studies were incredible, just like jaw-dropping results. I have a couple charts. Do you want me to show them?
You can. People can, if they're tuning in on YouTube, they can check out these charts. Otherwise, I will be describing them for the podcast listening audience.
I will. I will try to describe
Okay.
them too. So this first one shows two measurements of depression
Okay, we've
and
got
global distress.
Okay.
And as you can see, the baseline for prior to attending an ayahuasca retreat was, and they're using a mean BDI-2, the depression scores, like it's a validated, already accepted psychological evaluation. From 15 down to after the ceremony down to 6, and then 6 months later again down to 3. Now, I think that that's very, very relevant because 6 months after the retreat, their depression had continued to decrease. And that to me speaks to a very permanent change. Now, the epigenetic studies found the same thing, that there was a genetic change because of the plant medicine retreat. And so permanently, forever, a person's genetics were going to be different, obviously, unless epigenetically they were turned back on or, turned off. But that is incredibly promising results, really, really promising. Now, anxiety was the same. They measured 2 different levels of anxiety, how you react in the moment, and then just general anxiety as your personality. All of them were just incredibly significant changes for the better. And with regard to childhood trauma too, like just massive changes in where people were measured in terms of the severity of their trauma. So incredibly promising, really, really promising.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's incredible research. So this was done at your facility, the
Correct.
ceremonies. Oh, wow. Okay. We will try. I'm going to get those graphs from you and we'll throw them in the show notes so that everybody can see those because it's really impressive. And I do love that you pointed out that the numbers continued to get lower as time went on. And were those the people in the study, were they doing some kind of post-ceremony integration?
They were, but not for very long. Like we work with an organization called Ayahuasca Now What, which is people who completed our course and were facilitators for the Ayahuasca Foundation, who then started that organization. So they know exactly like what the people went through on the retreats with us. But not everyone, in fact, not many of the people chose to follow up with them. So I do a post-counseling session, but I would say like there was minimal like continuous follow-up. So with that 6 months, for example, maybe 1 or 2 sessions.
Wow. That's even more
Um,
impressive.
the anxiety chart was not, it was more like what I might have expected. The anxiety chart showed an uptick after the 6 months. And I was more expecting that, which I think most people would, like the treatment, especially because you're in the Amazon rainforest away from your entire life, and it's very laid back in the jungle. So the anxiety had an incredibly big change, and then a slight change back towards anxiety when people went home for 6 months later. I still think, like if you looked at the start and the 6 months, there's still a tremendous drop. But I think that's like what makes more sense to me. I was really pleased to see that the depression had continued to drop. And I would say that there's an incredibly powerful link between depression and addiction.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I know that you guys are going to be continuing to do more research on not just childhood trauma, but other forms of trauma coming up, correct?
That's right. We're just going to generalize it as trauma. So that will include PTSD and just every form of trauma. But we'll also now start working with veteran groups. So we'll be working like specifically with veterans to help them.
Oh, fantastic. We'll have to do a follow-up episode when that comes out. I would love to wrap up by hearing some anecdotes, if you could share, of those who were suffering with addiction and who came down and had some healing through ayahuasca.
Definitely. So a young girl named Lauren, I shouldn't say girl, she was a woman for sure. She was 27 years old, and man, that just makes me old. She came down also with heroin addiction, and she, I hope she doesn't mind me saying this, but she was a mess to the point where she didn't make it to Iquitos because in Lima she got so messed up in the airport that she lost her passport and lost like her bag, and like thankfully this man happened to like kind of rescue her and like kept her safe, and helped her to get to the embassy to get a new passport. And like it took like 3 days, and she missed the beginning of the retreat. And like it was like hit or miss as to whether she was going to show up. And and then she just had an unbelievable transformation. And of course, like, thought the same thing, like she's a whole new person. Went home, did fall off the wagon, but then very quickly, like, made a big change. She moved to another location. She moved away. She thankfully had a sister, so she moved in with her sister in a different state, started a whole new life. Then sent me a picture of her 1 year Narcotics Anonymous chip, and then got married, owns a business now. She just has like a totally wonderful life. And amazingly, like, her mother came and did a retreat, more so to just meet me and to thank me, for helping her daughter, and also to see like what possibly could have happened in such a short amount of time to make such a transformation. And that probably is my favorite story. But we had a man from England also, and both of them actually did like video testimonials. So if you wanted to look them up, you could find them. His name was Brad, and he was from the UK, and just also like just a mess, much like me, I guess. Someone who just didn't realize like how far their life had spiraled out until they I don't remember the exact incident, but he had like a hit a rock bottom moment too. I I believe that he had been working as an escort. He had basically become a prostitute on the street, and yeah, I guess there was an incident that woke him up to the rock bottom as well. And yeah, he had a total transformation. Exact same story. Went back, fell off the wagon, quickly got himself back on, moved to another country, and ended up now working at a healing center in Australia. And just he's a healer now, and he helps people through addiction. And just another wonderful story. And my very, very close friend, DJ Hush, I hope that's okay I tell his story. But yeah, he also, through an intervention of our friends, like, kind of was forced to come down, which I didn't feel good about. And and he kind of fought the process, but our relationship was so good that he like loved me enough to go through with it, and ended up making like a powerful, powerful transformation. And I still speak with him a lot. And of course, again, though, he moved from Massachusetts to Georgia, lived with his brother. And everyone's story basically has some similar themes to it. If you're in the world of addiction, you're not it's going to be almost impossible to stay in that environment and not be an addict. And so the transformation part, like I said, is almost like the easy part. The harder part is the changes that have to be made as a result of the transformation. I think that we probably hold on more to that part of our lives than we do to the part that we let go of when we free ourselves of addiction.
Wow. Thank you so much for bringing that perspective, because it's I almost want to title this Ayahuasca and moving for addiction, because it's so like that is an integral part. Like you said, the ayahuasca by itself, no, you have to have the ceremony, but for addiction, you have the ayahuasca, the ceremony, and a change of environment. And thank you for bringing that to the forefront for anybody who's listening and is contemplating using essentially any method to recover from addiction. That's a, the integration probably requires a new environment. And so thank you for bringing that up. Carlos, can you please tell people where they can find you and the foundation?
Sure. You can go online at ayahuascafoundation.org. You can find me on Twitter at Ayahuasca Found, on Instagram, Ayahuasca Foundation, Facebook, Ayahuasca Foundation Retreats, my YouTube channel. All of that you can easily access through the website. And if you hit the contact us and fill out the contact form, that goes straight to me too. So if anyone wants to contact me directly, you can do that easily.
Fantastic. And by the way, before we put this out, we'll get the A-OK from all your friends who were mentioned in it. So if you hear their names in the episode, don't worry. They're cool with being mentioned in this. We've gotten their permission. Carlos, thank you so much for sharing your story and the journey that you've gone through to help bring so much healing to others.
Thank you so much. It's been a blessing to be living the life that I get to live, and I know that you know what I'm talking about because we are all blessed once we realize it.
Yeah.
And it's been so great to reconnect with you.
Likewise, Carlos. Thank you so much. And for everybody else out there, until next time.